Murderers, as much as we despise them and their heinous acts, continue to fascinate us. It's a weird one, isn't it? We wonder what drives a person to commit acts of brutal depravity, how they manage to evade capture, and what eventually leads to their downfall. I mean, if they downfall at all, a lot of them just get away with that shit. Yet, there exists a niche and exclusive circle of killers who do not kill merely for the sake of murder. They're individuals who kill because they're hungry. Maybe not hungry, but they want to eat human flesh. Yep, we're talking about cannibalism. This practice is so barbaric that it defies modern understanding, except perhaps in extreme survival-based hypotheticals discussed among friends. Sure, mate, yeah, I'll eat you. Today, we delve into the lives of some of the worst offenders. Not those who acted out of a momentary weakness driven by hunger, but those who deliberately preyed on others with the express aim of turning the most dangerous game into a personal delicacy. So, you ready to meet them? And just a word of warning for those of you who like to watch my videos while you eat, maybe put the spaghetti down, okay?
Don't tell me what to do.
You probably know that data brokers are collecting your information and selling it. What you might not know is just how easy it is to find. I mean, go Google your full name, your middle name and everything, pop your city in there and see what comes up. Well, if stuff does, you can rely on Incogni to get rid of it. Incogni is a service, and today's sponsor, that helps remove your personal data from those data broker sites. It works incredibly well and incredibly easier. All you have to do is you sign up and they start sending out removal requests to over 250 data brokers. Plus, they've recently rolled out something new, the unlimited plan with custom removals. It lets you submit any website link where your info is exposed, even if it's not on that giant list of 250 of them, and Incogni's privacy team will review it, and if it's eligible, they'll work to get your data taken down. It's hands-off, it's private, and it actually works. Go to incogni.com/sideprojects or use the code sideprojects to get 60% off an annual plan. Take your data back with Incogni. And now back to today's episode. It is 1991 and a naked man in handcuffs is running down the street, screaming for help before he collides with two police officers. But this was no hapless lunatic. This man was a victim who had been drugged and assaulted. And believe it or not, he was incredibly lucky. The home he had just escaped from belonged to Jeffrey Dharma, the Milwaukee cannibal. He was a bad guy. You've probably heard of him. Most people know the deranged and depraved story of Dharma. He is one of the most infamous serial killers of all time, for very good reasons. The police took an interest in Dharma's residence at the request of the young victim who had escorted the man to his apartment. What they discovered there was gruesome and honestly just insane. Within the apartment, the dining room resembled a hardware store, stocked with tape, a hammer, a handsaw, an electrical drill, and acid. Don't know if you could buy acid at a hardware store. Don't spend enough time in hardware stores. Of course, owning these items is not illegal. What turned this ordinary day in Wisconsin into something straight out of a horror movie was what Dharma was doing with those tools. The apartment was filled with human remains in various stages of dismemberment. There were 7 human skulls, 3 of which were painted, 4 completely intact yet severed human heads, 1 of which was stored in the refrigerator, 1 dissected skeleton in a portable freezer, and 3 more skeletons in a 55-gallon drum filled with acid. A human heart and a pile of packaged human muscle fillets were later discovered in the freezer compartment of the fridge. This gruesome scene underscores the fact that Jeffrey Dahmer was not only a serial killer, but also a cannibal. Dahmer was, putting it mildly, a disturbed deviant who harbored a mix of ambivalence and hostility toward his victims driven by a deep sexual depravity, just when you think it couldn't get any weirder. He would scour local bars looking for a man or boy to take home, and when he succeeded, he drugged, assaulted, and killed them before butchering and consuming parts of their bodies. Dahmer also attempted to create a living sex slave by boring holes into the skulls of his victims while they were incapacitated and pouring acid inside. I told you, you should have put down the spaghetti. He staged his victims before, during, and after death, keeping souvenirs of his gruesome misdeeds in the form of body parts and photographs. It's safe to say that Dahmer was quickly apprehended once these discoveries came to light. It would have been weird if they were like, "No mate, it's good, off you go." He was able to evade detection for so long because his victims were often gay men, sometimes African American, and sometimes runaway kids. In a big city like Milwaukee, the disappearances did not raise significant concern until Dahmer's actions were finally uncovered. Between 1990 and 1991, it was revealed that he killed at least 11 victims, although Dharma later confessed having murdered as many as 15. He was sentenced to death, but before the state could carry out its justice, another inmate bludgeoned him to death in prison. And to that, I think we could all say, oh no! Dharma's legacy remains among the most savage and calculated in the history of serial killers. And if you hadn't put down your spaghetti yet, now is the time. I know the story of Albert Fish. It's fucking crazy. Albert Fish, born Hamilton Fish in 1870, was one of the United States' earliest recorded serial killers, preying on the weak and the vulnerable. Like many serial killers, Fish experienced a troubled childhood. Growing up in the late 19th century was no easy feat for anyone, and after the death of his father and a stint in an orphanage, Fish began to exhibit troubling patterns of behavior that only escalated over time. By the time he reached adulthood, Fish had become a sadist in every sense of the word. Influenced by a religious mania, he became obsessed with killing and mutilating children, specifically castrating young boys, because it's what the Bible wanted. It's remarkable that he wasn't caught sooner, given how blatantly he executed his crimes. In 1911, for example, he left one boy bleeding in the street before fleeing. By 1930, he had already been arrested 6 times, resulting in a stint in prison, as well as a stay in a psychiatric institution. But he was never charged with murder. His arrests were for passing a bad check, embezzling funds, and continuously writing extremely graphic sadomasochistic letters to women unprompted. I think we could all just be glad that he didn't have access to Instagram DMs. But there was more going on behind the scenes. He was suspected of murdering multiple children before his eventual capture. Some estimates put his body count at 8 victims, while others go as high as 15. With poor record keeping and his particular targeting of children from poor backgrounds, there was often little trace of his crimes. When he was finally arrested, he confessed not only to killing multiple children, but also to cannibalizing their bodies. Among those he admitted to consuming were 11-year-old Grace Budd, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney, and 8-year-old Frances McDonnell. He attempted to appeal to officials and reporters for sympathy. Dude, no. But as is often the case, child cannibals are seldom met with leniency. Ollie wrote this script, and to that Ollie I would say no mate. Fish was tried in 1935, pleading not guilty on the grounds of insanity, yet he was convicted regardless. Some jurors believed he was genuinely out of his mind, but even they agreed that the severity of his crimes warranted his execution. He was later put to death in the electric chair. And what do we say? Oh no! Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this case is that even today the full extent of Fish's crimes remains unknown. Some suggest that he might have attacked hundreds of young victims, which, if true, would place him among the most prolific child predators in history. To many, Armen Muse, the 42-year-old computer scientist from the German town of Rothenburg, appeared to be just an ordinary guy, a good neighbor who mowed lawns for free, repaired cars, and even invited people over for dinner. Yet few could have guessed that he might have meant that last part literally. Oh shit. In March 2001, the plastic facade of his neighborly routine crumbled when Muse went online and posted an advertisement seeking, quote, young, well-built man who wanted to be eaten. Unlike most cannibals, who impose their wicked fantasies on non-consenting victims, Muse was different, setting the stage for one of the most extraordinary legal cases in German history. Through his internet ad, Muse connected with 43-year-old Berlin engineer Bernhard Brandes. In fact, he received several willing responses, but Brandes became the lucky candidate. Muse had been fantasizing about cannibalism since he was 8 years old. However, it wasn't until his mother died in 1999 that his fascination transformed into an insatiable appetite for human flesh. Yes, the death of your mother is the sort of thing it does. On the evening of March the 9th, the two men retreated to the bedroom of Muse's residence. Brands swallowed 20 sleeping pills and half a bottle of schnapps before Muse, with Brand's consent, cut off Brand's penis and fried it for them both to consume. Later in the early hours of the morning, and again consensually, Muse stabbed Brandes in the neck, killing him. Afterwards, Muse dismembered the body and stored the human meat in his freezer, placing it next to a takeaway pizza, just in case he didn't feel like having human flesh for dinner that day, we suppose, while the skull was buried in the garden. He planned to defrost and cook parts of Brandes in olive oil and garlic, promising to use as best silverware. In total, he managed to consume over 20 kilograms of the man before the police finally arrived at his door. Muse's fantasy had turned into a nightmare. Ollie, mate, it was always a nightmare. God damn, dude. But this created a somewhat bizarre legal situation for the German courts because cannibalism wasn't actually illegal in Germany at the time. In fact, it still isn't legal. So, what could the police even charge Muse with? Murder seemed like the obvious answer, yet Muse had filmed the entire affair in great detail, proving that this act of cannibalism was truly consensual on Brandeis' part. Could someone be convicted of murder if the victim had effectively consented to it? As it turns out, yes. Prosecutors charged Muse with murder for the purpose of sexual pleasure and disturbing the peace of the dead. However, the fact that his victim was effectively drugged with sleeping pills and alcohol, and that this entire episode was captured on film, did little to support Muse's defense that it was a consensual act. Similarly, Brandeis' partner asserted that he was experiencing mental struggles at the time and that his participation in such an act was massively out of character for him. Muse showed no remorse for his actions that resulted in another man's death. He told the court that as a child, he felt lonely and neglected after his father abandoned him. Boo-hoo! Cry me a river, dude, you fucking ate someone! He also revealed that he had fantasized about having a younger brother, someone he could keep forever, by consuming him. On the first day in court, Muse stated, and we'll quote him here, "I always had the fantasy, and in the end, I fulfilled it." He also remarked that Mr. Brandeis tasted like pork. He was initially convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to a few years in prison. However, he was later retried for murder and convicted again. Ultimately, he received a life sentence, putting an end to one of the most bizarre cases of cannibalism in history. Alfred Pekka was known in his day as a quarrelsome Civil War veteran and prospector. He was not only a strong man, but also a rugged guide tasked with accompanying fellow miners through the San Juan mountain range between Colorado and Utah as they sought their fortunes. Pekka was moving a large group of men through the mountains when they set up camp at Chief Ore's campsite near present-day Delta, Colorado during the winter of 1873. Pekka and 5 other men decided to press on to the next campsite to save precious time in the worsening weather, a decision that would ultimately prove fatal. You see, the winter of 1873 in Colorado was not an ordinary one. It was uniquely harsh, especially in the Lake Fork drainage area where Pekka and his companions were hiking. Deep snowdrifts and sub-zero temperatures slowed the party, and their supplies soon dwindled. Wild game was virtually non-existent amid the heavy snow, and there were no fish to be found in the frozen streams and lakes. By the time the men reached the foot of Slumgullion Pass, having even chewed the leather from their boots, they were lost and they were starving. And then, nobody's truly sure about what happened next. Pekka arrived at the next settlement weeks later, but none of the other men did. He told the locals that the men had been lost in a snowstorm and had simply succumbed to the cold. Yet Pekka appeared suspiciously well-fed for someone who'd spent weeks in a mountainous, desolate winter without food. He also happened to have the other men's wallets. And I guess that's not so bad. They weren't going to use them again, were they? Because he fucking ate them, didn't he? It's fucking crazy, dude. Then people found strips of human flesh on him. A search party was sent out to locate the bodies, and at the foot of Slumgullion Pass, they were discovered. The men had been viciously murdered and cannibalized. It wasn't long before Pekka's story began to change. He claimed that one of the men, by the name of Wilson Bell, had gone mad with hunger and killed the other 4 while Pekka was away from camp looking for supplies. Pekka alleges that Bell had butchered and started to eat the men. When he returned, Pekka claims Bell attacked him as well, and he was forced to shoot the crazed man in self-defense. After several days of starving, he felt he had no other choice but to consume their flesh to survive. He's really going for that reasonable doubt, isn't he? Now, Pekka was arrested shortly afterward, but he escaped and remained on the run for 9 years before eventually being captured and sentenced to 40 years in prison after his death sentence was overturned. He was eventually granted parole by the Colorado governor and died in 1907 at a ranch near Denver from a stroke. Only Pekka can know for sure what happened in those mountains. However, 115 years later, in 1989, the bones were examined at the Human Identification Lab in Tucson, Arizona, to uncover the mystery of how the men died. The evidence showed that the bones were partially cannibalized and that the men did suffer violent deaths. Although various pieces of evidence tend to corroborate Pekka's second telling of events more closely, no one can know for sure who was the murderous cannibal and who was the desperate prospector struggling to survive. Today, a small stone memorial stands in honor of the men who Pekka allegedly killed. His dying words, according to the Littleton Independent, were, "I'm not guilty of the charge." Few cases of cannibalism are as disturbing as that of Isai Sagawa, also known as the Kobe cannibal. While other grisly deeds are noted for their brutality or the unflinching reaction to the loss of human life at the perpetrator's hand, Sagawa stands alone due to the terrifying reality that he got away with it. Sagawa was a diminutive, otherwise unassuming Japanese man who, despite his unremarkable appearances, exuded a slightly creepy vibe. Yet beneath the surface of this small, sickly individual lay a disturbed monster with an almost inhuman look in his eyes. It's one way of him being creepy, isn't it? Sagawa's story begins in 1981 when he was an international student pursuing a PhD in literature at Paris Sorbonne University. However, his cannibalistic tendencies had long been apparent. Sagawa himself told reporters that, quote, "The first time he ever thought of consuming human flesh happened in the 3rd grade after seeing a man's thigh. As he grew older, such desires only intensified." In Paris, he would later claim that every night he brought a sex worker back to his accommodation to try and shoot them, even though he was simply unable to pull the trigger. Everything changed in 1981 when he met a Dutch student named René Harteveld, who was also studying at the university. The two appeared to hit it off. Harteveld even sent a letter back to her parents in the Netherlands, describing Sagawa as friendly and intellectual. When he invited her to his home under the guise of a poetry reading session, she agreed, a decision that would prove to be a fatal mistake. As René sat in Sagawa's living room reading poetry aloud, he stepped quietly behind her. From a set of drawers, he retrieved a hidden carbine rifle. Approaching her, he pointed it at the back of her neck, and for the first time, he pulled the trigger. And what happened next revealed the monster inside. Over the coming days, Sagawa spent his time mutilating, assaulting, and consuming parts of René Harteveld's body. He ate portions of her thigh, buttock, breast, lips, and calves. Some he cooked, others he ate raw. Realizing he had to dispose of René's body, Sagawa dismembered what was left of his victim and attempted to erase the evidence in the Bois de Boulogne Park, the second largest such area in all of Paris. He transported René's remains in 2 suitcases, but was caught in the act and arrested by the French authorities 4 days later. And I've accidentally seen the crime scene photo. It's just not something you want to see, and it is something you can never unsee. Google Safe Search did not work that time. And by this point, I imagine your spaghetti's gone rather cold. This, for most stories about cannibalism, would be where the tale ended, but not for Sagawa. French authorities found him insane and unfit to face trial, placing him in a maximum security psychiatric unit for months. During this time, however, Sagawa's crimes were deemed so shocking that he became a minor celebrity in Paris. The newfound notoriety and perhaps the French taxpayers' disdain for housing a foreign cannibal eventually led the French government to deport Sagawa back to Japan, influenced in part by his wealthy father. And this is where everything went wrong. Sagawa was deemed psychologically unfit to stand trial, so the French authorities closed his case and sealed the records. After all, he was now his home country's problem. However, once he returned to Japan, the Japanese authorities conducted their own tests. They determined that Sagawa was perfectly sane, and the murder he committed was solely motivated by his own sexual perversions. Although they acknowledged that he was disturbed, they concluded that he did not require indefinite hospitalization. Meanwhile, because the French had dropped the case and sealed the records, the Japanese authorities just didn't have access to them. The absence of a trial meant there were no official records. Without such records, even in the case of a confessed murderer, especially one found to be sane, the Japanese had no legal basis to continue confining Sagawa, which is insane. He confessed to the crime, media reports chronicled what happened, but legally there was no hard evidence, so they let him go. Yes, they released a confessed murderer, cannibal, deviant onto the streets of Japan. In effect, Sagawa got away with his crime, leaving him with a completely clean criminal record. This case exposed a bizarre legal grey area in international law concerning evidence handling, legal technicalities, and countries' jurisdictions over certain cases. Worse yet, Sagawa made no secret of his crimes. He confessed repeatedly and recounted the murder to anyone who would listen. In the decades since the murder of René Harteveld, he published several books discussing the case, filmed documentaries, and even tried to shoot a porno film. Right. He effectively became something of a minor celebrity, able to profit off his brutal acts without facing any consequences, leaving the Harteveld family without closure. Sagawa eventually died at the far too late age of 73 of pneumonia in November 2022. A small ceremony attended by a few family members finally brought an end to this whole sorry charade. For some, a wandering life is a curse. For others, it's a blessing. For Andre Chicatillo, however, it provided the perfect opportunity to carry out a sick fantasy. Yet everyone who knew him regarded him as a normal man, a nondescript, unassuming individual who could never have been suspected of committing the brutal acts for which he was later convicted. Born in 1936 in what is now Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, Chicatillo's early life was steeped in the harsh realities of his environment. This background, with its complex experiences during his formative years, may have played a significant role in shaping the person he would become. It's well known that childhood trauma can affect everyone's development, and its influence may be even more pronounced in individuals like serial killers and cannibals. Chicatillo was born smack in the middle of Stalin's purges, a terrifying time when the police could simply show up at your door and take your loved ones away, never to be seen again. It was an era of intense trauma for rural communities and for places like Ukraine, which did not receive the same lucrative communal benefits of the Soviet system as Russia did. People were afraid. They were starving. At the age of 5, Chicatillo's own mother told him about his brother's disappearance before he was born. It was widely assumed that his brother had been killed and eaten by starving locals. His childhood trauma manifested in other ways too. Chicatillo frequently encountered dead bodies in the war-torn region where he grew up. He was also ostracized as a child because his father had been captured by the Germans in World War II, a circumstance that brought shame and ridicule. And much like other psychotic killers, he was a bedwetter until the age of 12. Once a cripplingly shy boy, he harbored a devil inside waiting to burst out. A serial killer, a sexual abuser, a cannibal. He muddled through his exceptionally mundane life like many Soviets of his time. After completing his education, he became a teacher, but was quickly ousted from the job when it was discovered that he was molesting students, spying on them, and engaging in somehow even worse behavior than that. During this period, he committed his first murder. There it is, the killing of a local 9-year-old named Elena Zakotnova. His second occupation was as a toll catch, a uniquely Soviet job title in which a worker from an industrial plant traveled around the country begging other plants for supplies. This role afforded Chicatillo ample free time, travel, and solitude. If you were designing a serial killer in a laboratory, this would be the job that they would have. Yet here was a soft old man who wore a suit and carried a briefcase. He appeared just harmless to everybody. For every other person growing up with similar experiences at the same time, that might be expected. But in Chicatillo, something was different, something deeply different, deeply disturbed. He primarily operated around the city of Rostov-on-Don, where most of his victims would eventually be found. After his first killing, he discovered an unending taste for human blood and the suffering of others. However, it wasn't until 1981 that Chicatillo received the opportunity to pursue his disturbing acts as a full-time pursuit. His victims were typically chosen from society's margins: young runaways, orphans, prostitutes, alcoholics, and the mentally handicapped. At railway stations, bus stops, and on the suburban Elektrika trains of the region, he would entice them with offers of food and drink before leading them to parks and forests where they were brutally killed. Boys were castrated, girls brutally defeminized, and many of the victims were partially consumed. In several cases, Chicatillo even gouged out their eyes, driven by the old superstition that the image of a murderer remained on the victim's retinas. Most of his victims were children. And the bodies soon piled high, and what followed was a truly despicable campaign that eventually saw Chicatillo charged with 52 murders committed over 2 decades, an astonishing number that dwarfs those associated with most notorious serial killers of the time. So how did he go uncaptured? Well, the victims were societal outcasts, and the Soviet media avoided reporting on such harrowing cases for fear that it would cast the USSR in a bad light. Meanwhile, the police were baffled. Chicatillo's job required him to move from place to place, allowing him to evade capture. However, once news spread about a murderous cannibal terrorizing Rostov, the police realized that they had to act. Several men ultimately served prison time for his murders, and one was even wrongly executed. It would not be until 1990 that a modern psychoanalytic profile precisely defines the type of man Chicatillo was. Shortly thereafter, the police recognized what to look for and they captured him. He was convicted in 1992, and on Valentine's Day in 1994, he was executed with a single bullet to the back of the head. A mercy that seemed too kind when compared to the suffering of his victims. Now, let's take you away momentarily to the island's paradise of Fiji, a land of white sands, turquoise oceans, and coconut trees. Yet during the 19th century, when this slice of heaven was far less touched by humanity than it is today, there was a monster roaming around. Ratu Udre Udre was a fearsome tribal chief so terrifying that his name was repeated. His very name struck terror into the hearts of men, but for Udre Udre himself, it only made his stomach rumble. He ruled over a portion of territory known as Raki Raki, a region in V2 Levu, so esteemed that they also named it twice. There, Udre Udre waged war with rival tribes and factions, leading his warriors into countless battles throughout his life. Yet it wasn't the challenge of fighting Udre Udre and his army that kept other tribal war chiefs awake at night. It was the terror of what might happen if they lost. You see, Udre Udre was not merely a chief, he was a cannibal. And not just a cannibal, but perhaps the most prolific cannibal to ever live. Cannibalism among Fiji's tribal populations at the time was not uncommon, though it was generally reserved for specific important ceremonies and events. Udre Udre, however, took this concept to an extreme. When men were felled in battle or captured by his tribe, they would soon become the chief's next meal. Udre Udre believed that by consuming his fallen foes, he absorbed their strength, making him invincible, a power that he could then use to secure victory in the next battle. And if that belief held any truth, he might as well have been unkillable, since every foe he vanquished ended up on his dinner table. Legends state that he was able to completely consume 872 human beings. Most cannibalistic serial killers are unable to fully consume even a single person, which puts Udre Udre in a league of his own. He preserved the flesh of his enemies after they died by wrapping them in banana leaves and placing them in stone enclosures, sort of like the 19th century Fijian cold storage. For every person he consumed, he placed a single stone, a practice that led people to arrive at that absolutely astronomical number. Some contend that his true number of victims could be as high as 999. Today, those very same stones encircle Udre Udre's tomb. Other legends state that he had hoped to reach 1,000 men eaten before he died, but mercifully for the warriors of Fiji, he passed away before reaching that milestone. Moreover, the bodies of soldiers could, for the most part, be safely returned after death, despite a reputation that was unconventional. Even by the standards of 19th century tribal Fiji, he was also a well-respected leader and warrior deemed to be fearless in battle. Cannibalism ended in Fiji shortly after the late 19th century, yet even centuries later, travelers familiar with the cannibal chief's legends still speak his name in hushed tones. They do so out of fear that his spirit, fueled by all the men he once consumed, might turn on them as well. Deep in American suburbia, the 1970s were characterized by high levels of trust. Neighbors watched each other's children, cared for their elderly residents, and most notably for this entry, left their doors unlocked, secure in the belief that nothing would ever be stolen in their close-knit communities. But what happens when someone not only ignores these societal customs, but actively preys upon them? Well, that's when you get Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento. When you assess Chase's childhood, you can see all the telltale signs of the monster he would later become. His parents were abusive, his father regularly beating him and his younger sister, and by the age of 10, he had already exhibited all three major indicators of potential serial killer behavior as outlined in the McDonald Triad: bedwetting, arson, animal cruelty. As a teenager, he became a heavy drinker and drug user, which only fueled his mental illness and ultimately led him to drop out of school. Chase was a paranoid schizophrenic, utterly convinced that something was wrong with his brain and his body. He even went so far as to shaving his own head to track the movements of his cranial bones, which he believed were shifting beneath his skin. He also believed that his heart was shrinking and turning to powder, a belief that motivated his acts of animal cruelty. He would kill animals, blend them with Coca-Cola, holding on to the delusion that consuming such a mixture would somehow stave off the transformation. In adulthood, he gained a reputation for bringing numerous local pets into his apartment, after which they were never seen again. His parents did all they could, securing an apartment and even bailing him out of jail, but they were utterly unequipped to handle the staggering mental issues that Chase faced. He was institutionalized several times and eventually released, with doctors believing that he was beginning to gain control over his illness. Then, in 1977, at 28 years old, Richard finally snapped and shifted his focus from hunting animals to preying on humans. He purchased a .22 caliber pistol by lying about his history of mental illness and numerous institutionalizations. Just like that, huh? Well done, America. Then he killed his first victim, 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin, in a drive-by shooting in late December 1977. It was a random, motiveless crime. Then, on the 23rd of January, Chase escalated. On that day, he entered the unlocked door of the home of 3-month pregnant Teresa Wallin while she was taking out the trash. He shot her 3 times and stabbed her with a butcher's knife. He then assaulted and mutilated her body, removing her organs, drinking her blood, and smearing the remainder on the wall. Chase believed that an unlocked door was an invitation to enter somebody's property. This, plus the blood drinking, is where he got his vampiric moniker. 4 days later, he struck again, this time at the home of Evelyn Miroth and Daniel Meredith. There, he brutally murdered them both, as well as killing the 6-year-old son of Evelyn Miroth and her 22-month-old nephew. Upon nearly being discovered, he stole the nephew's body and took it back to his apartment, where it would be partially consumed. Thus, the manhunt began. Following a tip-off sighting from a local, the police went to Chase's apartment. When he emerged carrying a box, everything was covered in blood, and Dan Meredith's wallet was found on him. Upon his arrest, the police discovered that Chase's home was filled with human blood. It was present in the blender and in the sinks, suggesting that Chase had been drinking it for some time. Inside his apartment, the walls and floor were also coated in sanguine. Further investigation uncovered the 22-month-old brain stored in a container and his body parts wrapped in plastic wrap. In addition, they found parts of Evelyn Miroth and Teresa Wallin in his refrigerator, along with several pet collars discarded on the counter. In 1979, Chase went to trial. His lawyer argued for second-degree murder. Bro, give him the fucking chair already, shit! Through an insanity plea, a fair defense given Chase's condition. However, the jury declared him sane, convicting him on 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentencing him to death as he deserves. Before the state could carry out his sentence, Chase committed suicide in his cell at San Quentin in late 1980 from an overdose, to which we can all, again, say, oh no! He remains one of the most deranged cannibals and killers to ever walk the streets. Have you ever heard of Sweeney Todd? Yes, indeed. The fictional demon barber of Fleet Street who turned his victims into pies? Well, for the small Brazilian town of Garrahan in the state of Pernambuco, however, this grim tale became a brief, brutal reality. Jorge Beltral Negromonte da Silveira was a 47-year-old man living with his 47-year-old wife, Isabel Cristina Torreo Pires da Silveira. These guys have long names. And his 23-year-old mistress, who also has a long name, Bruna Cristina Oliveira da Silva. Not that long. Together, they referred to the family unit as the Cartel, operating out of the home in which they lived. This was not a major criminal organization, but it could be considered more of a family cult. Jorge suffered from schizophrenia, experienced auditory hallucinations, and harbored an obsession with killing women. Little is known about the psychological conditions of his wife and mistress, but individuals with a stable grip on reality typically do not commit the kinds of crimes that these three did. In the town, for a number of years, several young women had been reported missing. They simply vanished, never to be seen again. Nobody suspected the trio because they seemed like a normal enough group, even if their personal values were a little bit non-traditional. They lured women into their home under the guise of seeking a nanny, a ploy that attracted the poor and desperate in search of a job. When these women arrived, they were murdered by Jorge, and that's when the real depravity began. Isabel and Bruna would then butcher the bodies, cutting them up before the trio partially consumed the remains as part of what they called a purification ritual, aimed at lowering the population of the globe. Their first victim, killed in 2008, had a 1-year-old daughter with her when she went to interview for the nanny position. After killing her, they simply adopted the infant as their own. In a gruesome twist, the baby girl was allegedly fed the No. Good Lord, people. Humans, what's wrong with you? And it goes even further than that. You use your imagination. As if to imitate the famous demon barber, the two women of the household were alleged to have cooked their victims' flesh into pastries, which they would then either sell or give away in the local area. The trio did deny this claim. While they did not deny the cannibalism, selling human pastries was where they thought the line was crossed, apparently. Years later in 2012, after 2 more women had gone missing, the police, with no evidence to locate them, had nothing to go on until a credit card purchase by one of the missing women pinged on their system at a local gas station. This eventual clue led to the discovery of the cannibal love triangle, which had used one of their victims' credit cards for some small purchases. And also apparently because they have a small brain. When police arrived, the perpetrators were caught and forced to confess to their crimes, including the first murder in 2008. Human remains were found buried in the backyard in a concrete pit, and a 50-book page written by Jorge titled Revelations of a Schizophrenic was also discovered, documenting his compulsions. When talking to the little girl, now 5 years old, she revealed that her father had killed 2 women. The trio was charged with murder, desecration of, and the concealment of a body. All 3 received sentences of decades in prison for their crimes. If there's one type of person we can all agree appears generally innocent on the surface, it's an old lady, a grandmother, perhaps even a great-grandmother, brimming with love, and she's got those cookies in the pantry. However, appearances can be deceiving when it comes to serious crimes. Old women are just like the rest of us, and they are no less capable of committing horrific acts if they choose to do so. Perhaps no one embodies that idea better than Tamara Samsonova, a 68-year-old Russian woman who back in 2015 you wouldn't have given a second glance while walking down the streets of St. Petersburg. And yet, if certain allegations are to be believed, she is one of the most fearsome female serial killers and cannibals to have ever lived in modern times. Now let's go back to 2015. A pedestrian was walking by their favorite scenic pond on the outskirts of St. Petersburg when they encountered a truly horrifying sight, a body wrapped in a shower curtain. But it wasn't a complete body, it was just a torso, with only one leg and one arm. This was later discovered to be the body of 79-year-old Valentina Nikolaevna Ulanova. Police were later called to the scene and immediately launched an investigation. Before long, they found themselves speaking with Tamara Samsonova. As it turns out, Valentina was actually an acquaintance of Tamara. A mutual friend had asked Valentina to provide lodging for the fellow elderly lady while her apartment was being renovated. Tempers soon flared, and after several months, the relationship between the two had soured. Eventually, Mrs. Ulanova asked Mrs. Samsonova to leave, but her request was refused. Later, Samsonova traveled into the city and convinced a pharmacist to sell her a prescription drug called phenazepam, benzodiazepine produced in the Soviet Union back in 1975. She laced a salad with it and fed it to Valentina. Once Valentina became unconscious, Samsonova proceeded to butcher her body with a knife and saw before attempting to dispose of the evidence at the pond and in the surrounding areas. She carried the body in bags, keeping the head in a crock pot. When the police discovered that the shower curtain in Ulanova's apartment had been torn off the railings and found traces of blood in the bathroom, well, Samsonova was arrested, wasn't she? But nobody could have ever guessed what she'd say next. While she confessed to the murder almost immediately, she also admitted to 14 other murders, revealing that Mrs. Ulanova was simply the latest in her spree. Police later discovered her diary in the apartment, in which she detailed some of her crimes in stunning detail. Writing down her crimes, huh? Small brain move. It is believed that her first victim was killed around 1995. Samsonova's husband, now suspected to have been murdered by his wife, went missing in 2000. Her diary also described an incident involving a tenant in her apartment whom she killed. I killed my tenant, Volodya, cut him to pieces in the bathroom with a knife and put the pieces of his body in plastic bags and threw them away in the different parts of the Frezensky district. Given the similarity between the disposal method described here and that of Mrs. Ulanova, it became clear that this was an established pattern. Yet, even that was not the extent of her depravity. She also admitted cannibalizing some of her victims after removing their organs, confessing to have boiled the head and hands of Mrs. Ulanova. Considering the lack of evidence among her other victims, but Samsonova is also something of an unreliable narrator. Her stories tended to change when she referenced details of her life, although she was unwavering in her confession to the murders and cannibalism. For example, she initially claimed to be an actress and a graduate of the prestigious Vaganova Academy of Russian Ballet, only to later state that she had worked as an attendant to one of the city's most prestigious hotels. Both accounts could be true, or neither, but she altered her stories so often that it was quite difficult to discern the truth. Her narrative effectively ended shortly after her arrest. She was placed in a psychiatric institution under compulsory treatment, and as far as we know, she's remained there since 2015. If she is still alive today, she'll be 76, and the full scope of her crimes may never be fully understood. People don't simply decide to start killing and eating people in their 40s and 50s, which makes it likely that there are additional victims who may never come to light. They call her the Baba Yaga, after the well-known character in Slavic folklore who is often depicted as a fearsome witch with a taste for human flesh. She may well have been one of the only female cannibal serial killers out there, and it serves as a stark reminder, just as many cases involving those who kill and consume their victims do, that appearances can be deceiving. Thank you for watching.